The end of the 40s saw a steady shedding of the old guard for the Swans. Ron Clegg won personal glory with the 49 Brownlow, and the addition of future medalist Fred Goldsmith at fullback certainly strengthened our squad. But it was always going to be hard to replace past champions. One to step into the breach was Bill Gunn, a dynamic half-forward centre-man who would go on to captain the team in the mid-50s and be our leading goal kicker in 56. It was the same year that saw the debut of a rover elevated from the fourths, who was destined to become known to all football followers. His name was Bob Skilton, inarguably the greatest player in Swans history. Skilton's undoubted brilliance proved one of the few positives when we were still struggling. New additions to the list did their best to give him support, like John Herriot, who was recruited as a forward but proved most effective with his strong marking at fullback, a position he would make his own in the Swans' team of the century. However, the team as a whole seemed destined to dwell down the bottom end of the ladder. The 60s dawned without much promise for the Red and Whites. When the old grandstand burnt down early in the decade, it seemed symbolic of the fortunes of our beleaguered club. Though spirits were momentarily lifted when the skipper took a second Brownlow in 63, the Swans appeared fated to remain also-rans. One new recruit who tried to buck against the general trend was Graham John from East Perth. A classy centre-half forward, he was a tenacious competitor despite a chronic knee injury. He was to give us extraordinary service on and off the field as a player, coach and administrator.
I really felt that we were going to be a part of something that was going to happen rather than happening now, and I wanted to be a part of something that was going to grow and be one of the strengths of that. The South Melbourne Football Club, they say great clubs need a soul. Well, they've always had a soul.
On the threshold of the 70s, we pulled off three major coups that seemed to promise some light at the end of the tunnel. The first was the acquisition from Port Melbourne of young centre-man Peter Bedford.
Well, it was a difficult process, not from my point of view, but Port Melbourne was reluctant to clear me, and I actually went without a clearance and incurred a 10-year disqualification. So there was great motivation to do well with the Swans when I went across.
The tough, skillful and inspiring midfielder had shown enough to suggest he might one day be the man to become his captain's successor. Champion player, Brownlow medalist and skipper of the Swans. He would eventually achieve them all, and more. Leading goal kicker from 71 to 73, he averaged nearly 2 a game across his career. Named as ruck rover in the Swans team of the century, in 1999 he was also inducted into the Australian Football Hall of Fame. A true champion by anyone's standards. The second was the coaxing from semi-retirement of Norm Smith, generally accepted to be the greatest coach of the post-war era. Finally, it was the signing of Ricky Quaid. One of the most impressive ruck rovers in the competition, his courage and commitment were undoubted. But he was also to play a bigger role in the future development of the football club.
I think, as Jack Dyer would say, I was a good average player. I think I'd struggled today, particularly with the pace and the intensity of the game. I sort of gave my best shot every game, and so from that point of view I was reasonably satisfied.
On field, the Smith experiment seemed set to reap immediate rewards. Under his wily guidance and against expectations, South ended the 1970 season in 4th position, the first time we'd made the finals in 25 years. Finally, the captain got to lead his beloved team onto the field at the business end of the season. Despite including such stars as John Rantal, Peter Bedford, John Pitura and Gary Bryce, we were knocked out of the race by St Kilda. In 1973, Norm Smith was replaced as coach by Graham John. In the same year, Peter Bedford was elevated to the captaincy. For the new skipper, it was to prove a baptism of fire. Like his predecessor, he was a gun player saddled with an inconsistent team. It would require an all-out effort simply to lift them off the bottom of the ladder. There were at least some positive signs. One of these was the signing of Graham Teasdale from Richmond. Playing initially at full forward, it turned out he could also play in the ruck. He topped the goal kicking in several seasons, including 77, when he took out the Brownlow by a margin of 14 votes. But the power of the central duo couldn't counter inconsistency across the field. As the 70s were fading, despite some brave individual efforts, we were struggling to finish higher than 8th. With new coach Ian Stewart at the helm, the Swans started the 80s with their best result for years, finishing 6th. But if things seemed to be looking up on the paddock, they were becoming increasingly traumatic off it. In simple terms, the club was broke, fighting to keep our heads above a sea of red ink. As Barry Round was installed as captain, there were a series of emergency meetings between our board and the VFL, who had already indicated that they were keen to relocate a team to play in Sydney. As news continued to leak out, it was met with anger and disbelief by many supporters. Protest groups began to rally, led by the Keep South at South Committee, and battle lines were drawn between those insisting the club stayed Melbourne-based and the pragmatists who argued that relocation was our only viable option. It was a passionate and, at times, bitter confrontation. But in the end, there could only be one outcome. And so by the end of the year, as the big-hearted skipper tied for the Brownlow, it was made official. Starting next season, the Swans would be heading north.